Okay, folks, we're just about ready to start, and thank you for coming. If you're in the hallway there, you may want to come in and grab a seat grab a seat and hang on, because this is going to be one of the best sessions of the whole conference. I'm glad you've made it for this. This is going to be a treat, and I'm looking forward to it. We're going to have some presentations, then we're going to have a little Q&A, because that's obviously what this crowd likes to do. So we're going to have a period of Q&A, and we'll get through this session quickly, and I'm looking forward to the comments we're going to hear. Two great speakers to introduce us to the topic here today, and then we'll see where your questions lead us. Our first speaker today will be David Wilkins, former U.S. Ambassador to Canada. For those of you who remember when Mr. Wilkins became the 21st Ambassador to Canada, 2005, 2009, in that era there, it was a period really when Canada-U.S. relations needed to be rebuilt. We knew that on the government side. The Americans, I think, knew that as well. And when Mr. Wilkins was appointed, we kind of thought, at least I kind of thought, I wonder what this guy's going to bring to the job. And somebody said, warned me, wrong word, told me, what you're in for is a real treat. This is a very experienced political guy. He's from South Carolina, pardon me. He's got 30 years of experience. He's been a speaker down there for a decade. He's he knows what he's going to do. And I thought maybe not. He came up here, and all he had to say was, Chuck, how about we have a cup of coffee, something like that. And I'll tell you, he had me right at about the southern drawl. He had me in about 30 seconds. He now works at Nelson Mullins Riley in Scarborough, LLP. He chairs the Public Policy and International Law Practice Group. He talks a lot and does a lot of leadership on Canada-U.S. relations. He was a leader on Canada-U.S. relations when he was here, and continues to do that work. So we're just delighted to have him here, and he will be our first speaker. Now, following him, he's going to, this is the charm offensive. The David Wilkins Charm Offensive will be our first speaker. Following that, though, you're going to, again, this is the hang on to your seat moment. Daniel Hannan, the Conservative member of the European Parliament from the United Kingdom, he has been a Conservative member since 1999. He's done okay. He's written 7 books. I've told him, really, there's time yet this year to write another one. I don't know if there's another one. He's written 7 books. His latest one is called The Plan, which is 12 Months to Renew Britain. It's a political bestseller in Britain. He is a leading Eurosceptic. He doesn't believe all answers are in the European Union. He's written many a book about that. And one of the things when I first looked it up, when I found Daniel Hannan's actually going to be here, you look on the internet and they say, you've got to watch this YouTube clip. And if you do, you will have joined the most watched political speech in British history on the internet when Daniel Hannan tears a strip. I don't know if he's going to talk about that, but if you ever want after that, you can't do it right now. Don't do it right now. But afterwards, you can have a look at that and understand why he is in demand as one of the best speakers from one of the countries which really spawns a lot of good speakers. So we have 2 great people to talk about conservatism abroad. Please join me in welcoming, we'll go one to the other, David Wilkins.
Well, thanks, Chuck, for that kind introduction, and to Preston for inviting me to this important conference. I'm very honored to be at your conservative family reunion. It's a great privilege to be in this room with so many friends and distinguished Canadians, all committed to the cause of conservatism. Now, I can't help but note that your next 2 speakers, Daniel and myself, are fluently bilingual. Daniel Hannan speaks fluent English, French, and Spanish. I speak English, Canadian, and Southern. And so I guess I should start, Chuck, by saying bonjour, y'all. It is wonderful to be back in Ottawa. It brings back a lot of fond memories. I remember my first time skating on the Rideau Canal and then having knee surgery 2 days later. I also remember doing my first winter in Ottawa, thinking that dirt never looked so good because I thought I would never see it again. And also, my fondest memory, first day on the job, June '05, I arrive in Ottawa. A few hours later, I'm attended a diplomatic reception, and as ambassadors do, you walk up to each other and say, how long you been here? So I walk up to the Greek ambassador. And I say, so how long you been in Ottawa? And he looked at me and said, 5 winters. And so I knew on the job, I said, how long was that? He said, a very long time. And I learned shortly what he was talking about. I'm also honored to be here with Daniel Hannan. Daniel is viewed as a hero by conservatives in my country. And Daniel, last month you gave a rousing address to CPAC in the U.S., and you said something I'll never forget. Don't repeat our mistakes. Europe is a grisly image of the future towards which your present rulers are intent on taking you. I'm living your future, and believe me, you won't like it. And you know what? You're exactly right. So thank you for sounding the alarm. And with that in mind, I'd like to just take a few minutes to chat with you about the current physical and political dynamics in the U.S., the state of conservatism in the U.S., and what the Republican primary races might be foreshadowing, and what is really at stake in the upcoming U.S. elections, and what it means to Canada. You know, every 4 years, we Americans like to say that this is the most important election in our lifetime. Well, this year really does feel like it is our last, best chance to stop the downward spiral. And at the very core of our unpredictable GOP primary season and divisive partisan politics is one all-important question Americans have been wrestling with since the election of Barack Obama in 2008. Will the U.S. reject European-style socialism and make the painful but necessary sound financial decisions that will revive our economy, reduce the size and scope of our government, and return America to its independent entrepreneurial roots? Or will we continue to move to the left and spin our way into economic disaster? The stakes are high, and how Americans answer that question in November will have a profound impact not only on my country, but on yours and the watching world. So let me give you a quick overview of where we've traveled the last 3 years. Last month, the President came out with his budget, and even the Democratic-controlled Senate ran from it. It calls for hundreds of billions of dollars in new spending. It shows deficits exceeding $600 billion in every year but one over the next decade, while the debt grows to almost $19 trillion. Back in 2009, this same president promised that he would, quote, cut the deficit in half by the end of his first term. Now, I don't know how you do it in your families, but at my house, when the credit card gets maxed out, I don't suggest to Susan that she go out and buy a new car so we can spend our way out of debt. We stop using that card and we pay it off. This simple notion makes a whole lot of sense to most Americans who are infuriated and frustrated by the excessive spending in Washington. And yet this administration's response to our crushing debt appears to be to triple down and spend trillions more. This administration has already spent almost $2 trillion more in 3 years than the Bush administration spent in 8 years. Add to that the proposed $2 trillion in tax increases, making it even harder for businesses to create jobs and for workers to spur economic growth. In short, the president's budget spends too much, taxes too much, borrows too much, and many political analysts think it's nothing more than a campaign gimmick. The very worst part of all this reckless spending, for the first time in U.S. history, there are more takers in America than makers. More than 67 million people in America now depend on the government for food stamps, retirement income, health care, job training, and a host of other benefits. If we don't reverse this trend, and reverse it fast, we know where we're headed, and it's called Greece. Unfortunately, the trend doesn't seem to be getting any better. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the federal government recorded its worst deficit in history in February. The U.S. government has borrowed 42 cents of every dollar it spends during the first 5 months of this fiscal year. Now, I recently heard former GOP presidential candidate Mike Huckabee say what scares him about our president is he doesn't know what he doesn't know. And unfortunately, our president doesn't have a lot of experience in the private sector and perhaps doesn't know what it means to be in business and have only one choice: balance the budget or close the doors, period. This administration appears to be not about equal access to the American dream, but about having the government ensure equal results. And some folks would call that tending toward socialism. And nowhere on the face of the earth have a people ever prospered by becoming wards of the state. The bottom line is it just doesn't work. Over 3 years of Obamanomics, the poor are poorer in the U.S., the poverty rate is rising, the middle class is losing income, and today, while the U.S. economy recently just created 227,000 net new jobs in February, we are still almost 1 million jobs shy of the January 9 jobs number when Obama took office. The great Margaret Thatcher once said, the problem with socialism is that at some point you run out of spending other people's money. Now, after Obama's historic election in 2008, it took about 12 months for many Americans to see that his agenda wasn't exactly what they had hoped for. And thus, the Tea Party was born. And these Tea Party folks are conservative Republicans, as well as what we used to call Reagan Democrats and independents, who are not demanding anything unreasonable or radical, as some in the media like to characterize it. Basically, they want Washington to stop spending money we don't have, and to stay true to the tenets of our Constitution, which grants power to the government only through the people and not the other way around. The result was what I like to call a correction election, the historic 2010 midterms, where the pendulum swung back from the left back to the center right. It was the biggest setback for a president in midterm elections since Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Democrats lost 72 seats in 1938. House Democrats today have the smallest number of members since 1946. So what happens in the 2012 elections? Right now, I think it is very likely that the House will remain in Republican hands, perhaps with fewer seats. And Republicans will likely pick up additional seats in the U.S. Senate. But with the recently announced retirement of Maine's Olympia Snowe and the likelihood that a Democrat will win her seat, a GOP Senate majority, which would require a net pickup of 4 seats, seems less likely today than it did a few months ago. But we are seeing some interesting trends in recent polls. The first is that Americans across the board have lost confidence in their Congress, and public approval of Congress is at its lowest point. But with the House in GOP hands and the Senate in Democrats' hands, and with many Americans liking their own representative but disliking the other guys, there is no clear advantage or disadvantage for either party in America's apparent contempt of Congress. Reminds me of what the great Ronald Reagan once quipped. I have wondered at times, he said, what the 10 Commandments would have looked like if Moses had run them through the U.S. Congress. Can you imagine? If Congress had a shot at the 10 Commandments, instead of 2 tablets, we'd have wound up with 2,000 parchment papers and a crushing sin tax. The other trend is that Americans are consistently defining themselves as conservative by a 2-to-1 margin. So with conservatism alive and well in the U.S., and with more than 60% of the country continuing to tell pollsters that the U.S. is headed in the wrong direction, why have the GOP presidential primaries been so erratic? And that's a great question. I think you're seeing a couple of things playing out in these primaries. First, Republicans are looking for the most conservative candidate who can win. The key is who can win. The economy is important. Social issues are less important, but winning back the White House is all important. The debates, now up to 26, counting forums and head-to-head matchups, have consistently changed the dynamics of the race. They have allowed underfunded candidates, especially early in the process, to stay relevant, stay in the limelight, and continue to get their message out with little more than the cost of a plane ticket to get to the next debate. And Americans are watching the debates closely. And after each one, it seems we have a new front runner, although it now looks like Mitt Romney is starting to break away from the pack. So while the nomination process likely won't be over until May, maybe even early June, I do believe that when the spotlight is focused on the Republican candidate versus the president, this race then becomes all about the incumbent and his handling of the economy. As far as the Republican primary goes, as you know, this past Tuesday was the mother of all primary days, Super Tuesday. 10 states at play, 437 delegates at stake. Ohio was sort of the biggest prize because it had 66 delegates, second largest number at stake, and it's a very, very important swing state. And Romney really had to win Ohio, viewed as the most diverse swing state, and he did. Now, the magic number to get the nomination is 1,144. Governor Romney has a significant lead now with, I believe, 437 while we were sleeping, or Chuck, at least some of us were sleeping last night. Romney picked up 18 delegates in the Virgin Islands. Santorum has 178, Gingrich 105. Romney has won 13 states, Gingrich 2, and Santorum 7. Primary today in Kansas, Tuesdays Hawaii, Alabama, and Mississippi. And really the pressure's on, I think, Gingrich to do well there. If he doesn't do well in the two southern states that play on Tuesday, then it might be difficult for him to maintain momentum going forward. I do think Governor Romney, though, is in the lead, obviously, and will win the nomination. He has won 55% of all the delegates at stake so far, and he could end up winning the nomination by just getting 48% going forward, as opposed to Santorum, who's got to get some 65% of the remaining delegates, Gingrich 70%. And so at some point, it really becomes a numbers game. And as importantly, the inevitability factor favors Romney. This past Thursday's Rasmussen poll shows 80% of Republican voters believe that Romney will be the party's nominee. And he is viewed as the strongest candidate to beat Obama. Now, President Obama will be hard to beat, but not impossible. He has the power of the presidency and has proved to be a prolific fundraiser. In fact, he has held 101 fundraisers to date during his presidency. That is more than twice as many as any other president in history. And 4 years ago, he was given almost carte blanche to write his own narrative. But now he has to defend his own record. And while Americans very much still personally like him, many don't appreciate his policies. From massive stimulus spending that failed to keep unemployment down, to Obamacare that was never favored by the majority of Americans, to the politically calculated delay and then rejection of the ultimate shovel-ready project, the Keystone XL pipeline, which is overwhelmingly favored by Americans. So what do we look for when the campaigns really heat up after the conventions this summer. Pay close attention to gas prices and the economy. Gas prices were $1.85 per gallon when Obama took office. Today, the national average for gas prices is $3.76 per gallon, having increased almost daily over the past 4 weeks, and already $4 per gallon and more in some states like Michigan. Most energy experts expect the national average to be $4 a gallon or more by Memorial Day. Now, back in 2008, Stephen Chu, who is now the Secretary of Energy, said, "Somehow we have to figure out how to boost the price of gasoline to the levels of Europe." Unfortunately, it looks like he got exactly what he wanted. And perhaps this gas crisis provides no clearer illustration of the difference between liberal and conservative policy. Liberal policy places more value on strident ideological ideas that ignore reality, restrict individual liberty, and create more need for big government, while conservative policy deals with reality and understands that free people, when left unfettered by big government, will soar, creating wealth and opportunity for the greatest number of people. Be that as it may, if the president can tangibly demonstrate that unemployment is truly trending downward, Americans still want to give him the benefit of the doubt. Unemployment rate remains steady at 8.3% for the second month in a row. According to last month's budget report, and I'm quoting, "The rate of unemployment in the U.S. has exceeded 8% since February 2009, making the past 3 years the longest stretch of high unemployment in this country since the Great Depression." The CPO went on to predict that unemployment will remain at 8% or more through 2014. Keep in mind that no president in half a century has been reelected with unemployment higher than 7.2%. But the bottom line is this: because of our electoral college system, this election really comes down to the economy and whether Americans in 12 swing states think they are better or worse off than 4 years ago. On the East Coast, you have Florida and North Carolina and Virginia and New Hampshire. In the Midwest, you have Pennsylvania and Ohio and Michigan and Wisconsin and Iowa. Out west, you have Colorado and New Mexico and Nevada that make up the key 12 swing states. And of those, 7 have already held Republican primaries. And Governor Romney has won 6 out of 7 of those states. I can tell you a couple of things for certain, though. If a Republican wins the White House, there will be immediate benefits for Canada. Immediate approval of the KXL pipeline and Canada's important and rightful place in North America energy strategy. Fundamental and tangible support of free trade, wholesale rejection of protectionism, including punitive cap and trade schemes that amount to nothing more than green protectionism, which unduly targets Canada. And perhaps, most importantly, any of the Republicans now running for president will make the hard physical choices and right America's economic ship and get our government out of running and ruining American businesses. I pray my country follows Canada's inspiring lead and votes for fiscally responsible leaders from the President to both houses of Congress, those who believe in American exceptionalism and the great American dream. America has always been a beacon of hope, a country where the only limits big dreamers faced were those they placed on themselves. But that has changed dramatically in the last few years. Our government now appears to be in the business of picking winners and losers of penalizing both the dream and the dreamers with punitive tax and regulatory policies in the name of fairness. Policies that are anything but fair and rob Americans of their independence. As Abraham Lincoln once said, America will never be destroyed from the outside. If we falter and lose our freedoms, it will be because we destroyed ourselves. And I pray America's best days are still those yet to come. It has been my privilege to share this time with you. Congratulations on your many successes, and may God bless Canada and God bless the United States of America. Thank you very much.
Merci Chuck, merci Monsieur l'Ambassadeur, et permettez-moi de dire que c'est pour moi un véritable plaisir de me trouver dans la capitale d'une nation libre et prospère et conservatrice. Believe me, my friends, that's not something you get the chance to say very often in the European Union where I come from. And certainly not in French. You know, Chuck and I and the ambassador, we're all ex-politicians. We were swapping campaign stories as we do on these occasions. There is nothing like an election campaign to remind the elected politician of the full diversity of wildlife that he represents in his constituency. We had an election last year in Britain. I knocked on a door canvassing in a town in my constituency called Woking, and it was answered by a little boy who must have been all of about 5, 6 years old. And he was wearing an enormous velvet smoking jacket, hanging loosely from his little shoulders. In one hand, he was swirling an enormous balloon of brandy, about the size of his little head. And in the other hand, smouldering slowly ceilingwards, was this great sausage-sized Cuban cigar. Well, as you do when you're canvassing, I leaned down, I said, are your parents at home? And he said, does it effing look as though my parents are at home? So, believe me, my friends, when I tell you, it is such a pleasure to be in a place where nobody can vote for me. You know, or against me. I can see a number of elected representatives in the room. This is a home game for you guys, but this is an away game for me. But you know, although I may be a neutral here, I'm not disinterested. And no Briton can be disinterested about the politics of Canada. We've been through too much together. You're too close to us. And so I hope you will allow me to presume a little on our kinship and say a word or two about your present political situation and indeed about this conference. I've noticed in the last 48 hours, both on this stage and in the corridors around, that people have been doing exactly what the Conservative movement should be doing, which is to pick holes in what the Conservative government is doing. And that's great. You're the people who ought to be doing that, right? That's your job. That's what the broader movement is for. But don't lose sight of the big picture. Of all the major economies in the world, Canada's is the only one to have come through the recent crash without this explosion in debt and tax and spending. And that didn't just happen by accident. It's very natural when you're close to something that you focus on the things that you don't like. You know, I remember I was a schoolboy and then a student when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister in the United Kingdom. And that's what I did. It's what we all did. Oh, the Anglo-Irish Agreement, the Single European Act. I can now see, with the perspective of time, something that I can perhaps see with the perspective of distance about contemporary Canada. We didn't know how lucky we were. Don't lose the big picture. They say no man is a hero to his valet, right? If you're standing very close to somebody, silver screen star, you see that there's makeup and it may not be put on perfectly. But you know, looking from where I'm standing, I see this country led by a government of patriots who have restored prosperity and pride, and led by a prime minister who is a statesman of the first rank. And I wish we had someone like him on our side of the Atlantic. You know, I hope you don't mind I say those things, but I don't really feel I'm among strangers here. It's one of those bizarre accidents of history and geography. My constituency is 22 miles from Europe, but I would never presume to tell a continental audience about their own internal politics. I feel, as Abraham says in the good book, I feel that I'm a stranger and a sojourner among them. I don't feel that when I come here. We may be sundered by thousands of miles. Canada is a different country, a sovereign country, a separate country, but it's not, for us, really a foreign country. And that's why I hope you don't mind if I talk a little bit about what's happening in Canada and about what's happening in the wider Anglosphere. I want to make a point that perhaps has been made before from this podium that can't be said too often. This government, this Conservative government that you enjoy now, didn't happen in a vacuum. There was a change in the political climate that made it possible. And the man who most effected that change is Preston Manning. And it's a real privilege for me to be able to stand in this room and say this. He was a great hero of mine when I was a student, but I don't want to build him up as some kind of John the Baptist figure who just prepared the way for somebody else. He taught me something hugely important, which has been a lesson that stuck with me all the way through my time in elected politics, which is that you don't have to be wielding the levers of power in order to change your country. Simply by leading the opposition as he did, Preston put a country that was on the wrong course back on the right track. That's the power of conviction and principle and selflessness and leadership. And that's a lesson that I think all of us can learn from. So it's a huge privilege to be able to say that here. And it's a huge privilege to be able to welcome Canada back to the Anglosphere. You know, I was born in the kind of Trudeau years. And all the time that I was growing up, Canada was seen abroad as a kind of outpost of continental Europe in North America. Right? Conrad Black, my old boss, used to say, we're English-speaking Scandinavians, we Canadians, right? And I could see what he meant, both in terms of foreign policy and in terms of domestic policy. And it's perhaps only now that we've got to the end of that period, that we've got to a restoration of conservative principles, so that you can see quite what an aberration it was. You know, up until then, this country was defined by its self-reliance, its independence, its freedom. An enormous territory like this isn't settled by people, you know, whose main preoccupations are a nationalized healthcare system and the supremacy of the United Nations. And we of all people are delighted to see Canada back. The first time that Stephen Harper crossed my radar was his first trip abroad when he was leading the minority, his first foreign speech, I think, even as Prime Minister, when he was passing through London on his way to a G7 summit in St. Petersburg. And he made a beautiful and touching speech about the importance of the common law and parliamentary tradition as the basis of Canada's freedom. Now, as a matter of historical record, it was pretty uncontroversial. If he'd been speaking to a seminar of academic historians, it wouldn't have been an especially exciting thing to say. It was a rather obvious point. But you know, what a change from what we'd had up until then, which was Canada's this happy multi-culti fusion of indigenous peoples and Acadians and illegal immigrants. You know, it was... And I thought, welcome back, and of all people, we have cause to be grateful to have you back. You know, in the First World War, 70,000 Canadians died at Vimy Ridge, at Passchendaele, and at the Somme. Of a population of 7 million, 70,000 fatalities. Another 45,000 in the Second World War, all for the sake of a country which, in most cases, they'd never set eyes on. So believe me when I say, no Briton can be disinterested about your politics. The sturdy common sense here of a patriotic people has now imposed itself on the preoccupations of a bien-pensant elite. The same has not happened in my country. You have convincingly rejoined the Anglosphere. We are still wrenched from our natural orbit and attached to the European Union. You've escaped your Trudopia. We are still stuck in Europe. And only now, perhaps, does the full implication of what our fathers did in the 1970s become clear. You know, when we joined the EU, most British people saw it as a kind of trade-off between the politics and the economics. All right, we'd be losing a little bit of sovereignty, that was a bad thing, but in exchange we'd be getting access to this great common market, right? Nobody looking across the channel today still makes that equation. We see what's happening on the continent, and we understand that European integration means the destruction of our democracy and the destruction of our prosperity. This is not something that's just been caused by the euro crisis. It's been decades since you could find any opinion poll in Britain suggesting that people would vote to remain in the European Union. It's a system that's emptied our seas, that's wiped out our countryside, and above all, it's a system that has vitiated our law and filleted our democracy. 4 out of every 5 laws and regulations in Britain now come from Brussels. Right? Come from people not just that we didn't vote for, but people that nobody voted for, by appointed European commissioners. You'll often hear it said that the European Commission is undemocratic in the sense that none of its members is elected. But you know what, my friends, it's worse than that. Uniquely, in Western civilization, the European Union has contrived a system which is in fact anti-democratic in the sense that you generally have to have lost an election before you're appointed to the European Commission. So it's only when you've been expressly rejected by your voters that you are invited to come and rule over them. Well, is it any wonder that a system deliberately invulnerable to public opinion, a system that was designed not to be immune to popular pressures, has led to this expansion of government, this explosion of debt, and, predictably enough, has ended up where we are now. Our treasuries are empty, our credit is exhausted, and the only solution that Brussels has to the debt crisis is to carry on borrowing and carry on spending. It's the American writer Mark Twain who said that if all you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail, right? If you're a government and you spend money, this is what happens. Whatever the crisis, your first instinct is to reach for your wallet. Or rather, your first instinct is to reach for somebody else's wallet, because not a lot of people know this, bureaucrats are immune from national taxation. It's a fact that they don't bruit about very often, right? So when they talk about paying this price to keep the single currency together, it's of course not they who are going to be paying it. It's going to be a price that is inflicted on the peoples, and we can now see how high that price is. We are inflicting generational poverty and deflation and unemployment and emigration on the Mediterranean countries, and generational tax rises on the northern European countries in order to pay for the transfer payments. All in order to keep the euro together. All rather than admit that the single currency was a mistake. All in order to save face. To pluck an appropriately apt Greek metaphor, these must be the most expensive faces since Helen of Troy's, which launched 1,000 ships. And that's what we joined. Thinking that we were hitching our locomotives to this, we were hitching our wagons to this powerful locomotive, we've in fact shackled ourselves to a corpse. Let me give you a statistic that scared me when I first saw it. The year that we joined the European Union, 1973. Western Europe, which I'll define for these purposes as the 15 member states before we admitted the post-communist countries, Western Europe accounted for 38% of world GDP. Today, that figure is 24%, and in 2020, it will be 15%. Over the same period, Canada's share of the world GDP, and indeed the United States, has remained pretty solid. That is the generational shift in power and in wealth away from Western Europe. We have confined ourselves in a cramped and dwindling customs union, and in so doing, unforgivably, we turned away from the parts of the world where the growth still is, not least this country and the wider community of free English-speaking democracies. Truly, that mistake that my father's generation made was the most calamitous in our recent history. I want to say a word or two about the Anglosphere, about the alliance of free English-speaking peoples. And let me say, je m'adresse à vous comme un admirateur convaincu de la culture française. Personne n'est plus conscient que moi de la contribution des francophones d'Europe et d'Amérique du Nord à la civilisation occidentale. When I talk about the Anglosphere, I am not positing a geographical or an ethnic unit, but rather a community of values. Indeed, one of the great contributions that my country made to the world was the development of the notion of a civic rather than an ethnic conception of nationhood. John Locke in his original compact. Something that makes us very different from a number of neighboring countries in Europe which define nationality in terms of blood and heritage or birth and territory, is that we had this idea that provided you bought into the values, it didn't matter where your parents came from. Go back 100 years, and 80% of British subjects were neither white nor Christian. This is not a new phenomenon, but they felt part of the brand. And hundreds of millions of them, twice in the last century, were prepared to cross half the world in order to take up arms for a country on which they'd never set eyes, because they felt part of those values. And that, I think, is something that we've bequeathed to all the other English-speaking democracies. Of course, it took form in the old courthouse in Philadelphia in the US. But it's also the basis of Canadian nationality, of Diefenbaker's One Nation, One Canada. You know, the idea that provided you believe in freedom, in parliamentary supremacy, and in the shared values that we have, it doesn't matter where your grandparents came from. And what are those values? What is it that defines us as Anglosphere peoples? Well, the origin of it is something so sublime and so miraculous that the longer I think about it, the harder I find to explain it. And that's the common law. This extraordinary, providential idea that the law doesn't emanate from the government, but rather the law was already there and the government must be subject to it. That even the king and his ministers are forced to obey the folk right of inherited law that came from somewhere else. Where did it come from? Nobody really knows. We inherited it from our parents, they from theirs, and so on, back to some point lost in the early Anglo-Saxon settlements. I don't know how it happened, but it happened. And once it was there, it defined the relationship between state and citizen. On the basis of a common law system, we understood that the government was there as the servant of the rest of us rather than the other way around. Laws did not emanate from the legislature. It was not above the rest of us. The relationship between government and governed was a different one. And from that basis comes all of the other things which the English-speaking peoples have given to the world. Representative government, control of the executive by the legislature, this extraordinary idea that taxes should not be levied nor laws passed except by our own elected representatives. Property rights enforced by an independent magistracy, free contract, personal freedom, they all go back to that extraordinary idea of common law. And it's made our countries prepared to take up arms where necessary in defense of those values. Not every country has a great story to tell. You look back at the great conflicts of the last century. How many countries were consistently on the right side in the First World War, in the Second World War, in the Cold War? Who consistently got the big calls right? It's a fairly small number. But it includes all of the Anglosphere democracies. You, us, the United States, Australia, New Zealand. And why is that? Well, something made people prepared to take up arms for freedom. And they may not have defined it in terms of some lecture about common law, but they would have understood deep in their marrow that they were defending a system that was free against a system that was tyrannical. You look at the enormous war memorials here in Canada. Ask yourself, were those young men crossing the ocean simply out of some kind of tribalism? Simply because of some coincidence of language? Was it no different from the breakup of Yugoslavia or the Hutus and the Tutsis? Was it simply some kind of ethnic identification with Britain, or wasn't it a belief that we were fighting for a better way of life, a way of life where the citizen was free and where the government couldn't exalt itself over the individual? That's a pretty good story. And it's a story that we shouldn't be ashamed to pass on to our children. They're not just a random set of individuals born to another random set of individuals. They are the inheritors of a sublime tradition. Not far from here, there's a grave which contains the remains of my late uncle. He was training here during the Second World War, and he was a fatality during a training exercise. It's not a very glamorous way to end. They don't make films about it, but it was a very common fate for a lot of people, a lot of participants in that conflict. More people were killed in training in the preparation for D-Day than were killed in enemy action after the landings. Of course, this was a long way from home. And a couple of years after the funeral, which my late grandfather couldn't make, he got a letter from a Canadian woman. She'd inferred from the inscription on the grave that the family was distant, and she'd sent a photograph. She said, "I'll look after it." We never met her. My aunt lives in New Zealand, in Auckland. This is her 90th year. 2 years ago, she got a round-the-world ticket, and for the first time, she was able to come and pay her respects at her brother's grave here in Canada. It's a small Anglosphere story. It's not nearly as dramatic and exciting as some. But it reminds us of what it was that we were fighting for and what it was that we have in common and what we still could have in common as free people living under our own laws and our own parliaments. Our fathers, yours and mine, were prepared to defend with force of arms our independence, our liberty. It doesn't matter where our ancestors came from. We are all joint inheritors of that sublime patrimony. It's our privilege and it's our task to cling fast to that heritage and to pass it on intact to our children.
Well, so I warned you to hang on to your seats. So this is a great start. We got time for a few questions, and as one of the earlier moderators had mentioned, let's try to keep it to the questions. Comments are welcome, but only if it leads up to a pretty quick question. So I'll kind of watch that, and we'll start here, and then we'll go back and forth from mic to mic. Go ahead.
I don't think I've ever actually followed such an amazing presentation, so I'm feeling clumsy already as I begin to speak. So first of all, when you were describing being in England and looking across the channel to these other organizations and governments that were spending your money, coming from the West, we sometimes feel that way as we look across the Rockies to Ontario. But my question for you is that as with anything, there's an ebb and a flow, and there are trends, and there are moments in time where people look and learn lessons. Is it possible that right now within England and within hopefully Canada and some other countries that we're looking at the lessons of the EU and the lessons from Greece, and that this may in fact gel us together as conservatives and set some trends for perhaps in the next 50 years where we do see austerity and fiscal responsibility coming back to our countries?
Thank you. Well, here's an interesting fact that occurred to me. I was in Australia 2 weeks ago as part of my Anglosphere tour, and the Australian Labour Party is in meltdown. They've got a majority of 1 or 2, depending on whether you count the Speaker, and I can't imagine that they will see out the year. We will then, if Tony Abbott, as I fervently hope, wins the election in Australia, there will be a full house of conservative Anglosphere governments for the first time. It's like Halley's Comet. It kind of only happens every however many years. You know, in Canada, in the United Kingdom, in Australia, in New Zealand, even in Ireland. And we're just waiting for the last piece of the jigsaw to fall into place. Now, why is that happening? Why is that? Well, I don't think people have changed their minds. I think one of the things that all of those countries have in common is that people are wiser than their leaders. Had this policy of the bank bailouts and the expansion of government been put to referendum in any of the participating countries, I suspect it would have been thrown out. And yet, almost everywhere, there was a political unanimity in the panicky days following the Lehman crash. We must do something. And that something, of course, is always spending money. Politicians in their panic turned to the one set of people who could not give them disinterested advice, namely bankers. Well, if you ask a banker whether you should subsidize banks, what do you expect him to say? If you ask the bakers whether we should subsidize bakeries, what would you expect them to say? They're the one lot of people you don't ask. And I remember at the time being one of a tiny number of elected British Conservatives who was against. And a very senior member of my party sent me a stroppy email saying, Hannan, you are completely on your own on this. You and Ron Paul, he said, you're out on your own on this bailout. And 2 weeks later, I saw the first opinion poll and I pasted it into a very smug email, which I sent back to him saying, oh, look, it turned out to be me, Ron Paul, and 82% of the British electorate, right? People are wiser than their leaders. People understood that you should, and it's that wonderful Burkean wisdom, don't mistake the importunate chink of the crickets for the wise cattle chewing the cud in silence. Don't imagine that those who make all the noise are the only inhabitants of the field. What could we do about it if we get this alignment of Anglo-spherist governments? We're the problem. The United Kingdom is, if you then try and go beyond the goodwill of the English-speaking peoples and try and translate it into concrete policy and say, let's have a free trade area, let's have a free labor movement, let's have enhanced military cooperation, you keep bumping up against the realities of EU membership. And that's why I've made it my life's work to restore our independence.
Two quick questions. The first one is, can you repeat your opening comment in English? And the second one is, you've spent a lot of time saying very nice things about us, which we greatly appreciate, of course. But do you see any difficulties or dangers, things we should be worried or alert about in Canada?
Thank you. I'm reassured to see that Canadians will still struggle to take a compliment and will look for the downside. As someone with a Scottish Presbyterian mother, it makes me feel very much at home. My opening remarks was that it was a pleasure to be in a country that was free and prosperous and conservative, or at least in the capital of such a country. And for a long time, as I was growing up, you couldn't say that very often about Canada, even when there was a notionally Tory government. And this is why I say, don't lose sight of the big picture. In a world full of governments which are running enormous deficits and are grotesquely expanding state power, the little 10% of it that you did here and which you're now reversing from, believe me when I tell you, there is almost not a politician in Europe who would not gladly swap our problems for yours tomorrow.
There has been some discussion in this side of the pond about the Anglosphere. I remember in particular a series of letters exchanged in a rabid right-wing rag known as the National Post. But one idea which has been floated is that the members of the English-speaking countries should get the heck out of existing commitments like the EU, NATO, United Nations, and form their own political and possibly military organization, which we, for want of a better term, we will call the Anglosphere. What are your views on this?
I'm in favor.
Hey, my question's for former Ambassador Wilkins. Governor Mitch Daniels, in his response to the State of the Union, sort of outlined a conservative future, an idea of how a conservative future would work in the United States and going forward. And it was really different than just saying he was, instead of just basically critiquing what the Obama administration had done, he also provided a way saying this is what we would do differently, and this is sort of our vision for the future. And do you think that in going into this election campaign, it's important to not only be critical, and of course we can all be critical of the Obama administration, but more so making sure that we provide that alternative for a vision for America in the future? And what would you say to that, and what is that vision?
Well, absolutely. And first of all, thanks for asking me the question. I was beginning to feel like you didn't love me for a minute. You're exactly right. I mean, you can't just criticize the other side. I mean, whether it's Mitt Romney or whoever our nominee is, has got to lay out for the American people how they will do it and the vision going forward. But I think that among the candidates for president on the GOP side, I mean, I think that vision is pretty uniform. I mean, we've got to stop spending money we don't have, and we've got to pull back the regulations and let free enterprise thrive in the United States. That's what made us great. And we've got to restore individual rights and freedoms to the American people, and don't overburden them with taxation, don't overburden them with regulations. But you're exactly right. You can't just criticize the other team. You got to lay out your vision, and you know, the American people they're looking for leadership, and whether they like somebody or not, in the end, leadership wins. And if they think they are the leader to take us forward, then they'll elect them. And I believe that you know, it's going to be a tough election. I think there are a lot of people talking about now this primary season, we're just beating each other up. I actually think it's good for the Republican Party. For example, Ohio. Had it not been in play, and Romney barely won it, but had it not been in play, he wouldn't have the ground organization and have the precinct organization in parts of Ohio that he's got now. And as I mentioned, he has, I think, won 6 or 7 of the swing states that have already had primaries, and so those are states where he's organized. And so it vets you, it helps you get organized, and it lets the American people feel like they're part of the process. Unlike years ago, after Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and maybe Florida, the election was over. And what many of the state Republican parties did, they went to pro rata distribution of the delegates, and that obviously protracts it and makes it a longer process. But I think in large part that's helpful and healthy. It also means once you get a lead, it's hard to lose it because it's a lot harder for the other guy to catch up with you. And that's why I believe the numbers just look like Romney's going to eventually win, and eventually the other guys will run out of money and they'll get out. Then the motivating factor is take back the White House, and I think you'll see the Republican Party come together, and then starting in June or maybe July, you'll see that vision laid out by the Republican nominee.
We're going to try to get through the people that are still standing, or that are standing at the mics. There's 3 of you, so if you're quick with the questions and the answers, we'll get through this. So go ahead.
Once again, coming back to the question of Europe, in the last couple of months, there's been Prime Minister Cameron's refusal to sign on to the new fiscal arrangement, basically the European countries sacrificing control of national budgets to basically back to the European Commission or to the European government. There's been comments in the British press about how this is going to leave Britain as an outsider in Europe. I guess the question would be, moving forward, how do you see Britain's relationship with the European Union moving forward from here?
We had an opportunity. The new fiscal union treaty could have been the main body that became the political union, leaving the European Union. So, you know, you'd have two separate bodies, if you like. You'd have the old European Union, the EU, which would kind of become a shell as its powers drain, to the new FU, which initials neatly summarize the attitude which its leaders take to their peoples. You know, you're Greek and you're fed up with paying all this money to foreign bankers, FU. You know, or you're Irish and you're fed up with your referendums being swatted at FU. Or, you know, that opportunity sadly has passed because we've effectively climbed down from the substance of the veto, if not the fact of not signing up. Ultimately, this issue is going to have to be determined by a referendum. The question of Britain's relations with the EU is going to have to be done through an act of collective national endeavour. My short-term energies now in Britain are all on the referendum campaign. If we can put enough pressure on candidates of all parties in individual seats to commit themselves to voting for an in or out vote, sooner or later one of the parties will turn and swim with the current. You can't struggle on forever against public opinion. Now, I will accept the result of the referendum either way. You know, if I've misread the temper of my countrymen, if they vote to stay in, they weigh the thing up and they like it, that's it. I will retire quietly from public life. I'll grit my teeth, you know, accept it with good grace. I'll never again come and trouble your Manning Center conferences in Ottawa. But let's at least have the vote. You know, the only argument now against a referendum is fear of the outcome, and in a democracy, that is not a good reason.
To use a different phrase than grit your teeth, that's a Canadian thing. We'll talk about that later. Over here.
I'd like to thank both of you for all of your positive comments about Canada. I think that's something that is very good for us to hear and also to learn how to appreciate. Especially, Mr. Hannan, I'd like to thank you for reminding us that the purpose of law is actually supposed to be to protect freedom. And I was wondering if you could give us any ideas that you might have about how we could promote more of this type of culture here. Thank you.
Look, like I mentioned, I'm in an Anglosphere tour at the moment. I've just been in Australia. One of the things that we had in the United Kingdom that we've lost, but that still survives here and in the United States and in Australia, is federalism, or some kind of jurisdictional competition at a subnational level. And it is the biggest constraint on government. You know, you can only get away with increasing your taxes, your regulations, up to a certain point if there is a more competitive jurisdiction next door towards which people can flee. And one of the real tragedies of the United Kingdom is that as part of the process of centralizing all of our powers in Brussels, of pushing all our jurisdiction upwards, we've lost that municipal autonomy, that proper localism that our great-grandfathers would have taken for granted. So the single biggest thing you have going for you, the thing from which everything else will follow, is provincial autonomy. If I were a Canadian politician, my big issue would be taking power from Ottawa and giving it to the provinces, and then taking power from the provincial governments and giving it to the local councils.
My name is Jessie Legary. I'm from BC. And Mr. Hannan, you spoke a lot about a common heritage of common law and how important that is to our founding principles and moving forward. My question relates to foreign affairs then. How do you see us promoting democracy, and is that even possible in tribal nations where they don't have that common heritage? So just how successful you see that being?
Well, one of the things that makes the EU different from the traditional policy of the US and now of Canada is that they are not interested in promoting democracy. They're interested in promoting stability. And stability is very handy for the people who happen to be in power in any given place. It's not always so handy for the people living under that system. The Soviet Union was a remarkably stable system, but it wasn't much fun to live there. I do not believe that that countries are unsuited for freedom. You know, the Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen made a great observation where he said, "Don't ask whether a nation is fit for democracy. It becomes fit through democracy." The more people become accustomed to interacting as free citizens, the more they get the hang of it, and it's a process that will grow. But when you speak about tribal countries and so on, I think there is one important qualifier. For a democracy to work, there has to be some sense of community of identity. People have to feel that they have a certain amount in common one with another. That's why democracy will never work at European Union level. That's why on the day that I got in 1999 as an MEP, I was elected on a smaller turnout than the number of people who voted the following day in the eviction round of our version of Big Brother, right? That's the disconnect between the European Parliament and the European peoples. Not I think because they had it in for me personally, or maybe they did, but it's simply because nobody really feels European in the same sense that somebody might feel Norwegian or Canadian or Japanese or whatever it is. And so where there are artificial boundaries and where there is a lack of community of identity, it is difficult, because to have a democracy, you need a unit with which we identify when we use the word we. One of the speakers in the Quebec session this morning was making a point about multiculturalism, about the importance of arriving in a country and identifying with the we, the new we, being the unit to which you've come, what you would call a demos, right? If you take the demos out of a democracy, you're left with a kratos. You're left with the power of a system that has to compel by force of law what it can't ask in the name of civic patriotism.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And maybe that's a good segue, if I can use it, to that sense of commonality that you spoke of there in your last remarks, which reminds me of a little bit of the brochure that you've seen, for the Manning Center, which is, this is a family get-together. And I don't know what you thought, but I thought it's pretty nice to see other parts of the Conservative family live and well, thriving in the United States of America, Great Britain, and other places around the world. And I just want to, if you would join with me in thanking these folks as being part of our Conservative family, and they're welcome back anytime they like.